Welcome back to the Bob Fu Report. My name is Jonathan Dingler, and today I'm going to be bringing you the headlines in China regarding human rights, religious persecution, and rule of law. The Beijing Olympics recently ended in February, and many headlines came out of the games this year. One of them being that Olympic athletes were facing detrimental conditions in quarantine hotels, and a Uyghur also lit the Olympics torch at the end of the opening ceremony, and then disappeared for the rest of the games. Well, the publicity is not over for Beijing and its winter escapades, as voiced by Zhang Zhan in his interview with Voice of America earlier this month. Xinjiang, the region where many Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic Muslims are being held captive, there's been a recent uptick in winter tourism. As some of you know, the U.S. Department of Defense and other organizations have estimated that at least 1 million individuals are being held in these vocational learning centers where they are facing torture, sexual assault of many kinds, sterilization, and of course forced labor. But in the northern region of Xinjiang is apparently a winter wonderland, as CCP authorities would want you to believe. And Zhang Zhan, a partner of China Aid and the founder and leader of Atatürk Kazakh Human Rights, talked about this recent uptick in an interview with Voice of America. He says, "This means that Kazakhstan changes from being Beijing and CCP's puppet to Putin's. It is not the CCP puppet anymore, so the CCP suddenly turned favorable to Kazakhs in Xinjiang in order to please Kazakhstan authorities. That is why China suddenly launches its massive winter tourism in Xinjiang and let 3 Kazakhs appear in the Beijing Olympics." What this winter tourism is doing is that it's trying to whitewash, it's trying to cover up the fact that atrocities are happening in the southern part of the region. As some of you may know, Kazakhstan in January had a civil rights upheaval with many of the citizens trying to overthrow the government in a peaceful way. But unfortunately it failed. And now many believe that instead of the Chinese Communist Party being the most influential body in Kazakhstan, it's now Russia. So that's a word from Zhang Zhan. Another story that we have today has to do with a house church in Beijing. Right before the Winter Olympics, 5 of their members were kidnapped. This was a pretty recent development and something that China Aid wasn't aware about until after the Olympics already took place, which is pretty commonplace for these sorts of situations. The Chinese authorities in 2008 did something very similar where they arrested all of the journalists or political dissidents so that they wouldn't interact with American or Western media. And we're seeing something very similar here happen with this house church. This house church is called Divine Love Fellowship, and it's one of the earliest house churches in Beijing. It was actually founded around the time of the Tiananmen Square demonstrations on June 4th, 1989. Xu Yonghai is an elder of the church, and he was kidnapped on February 4th of 2022. He was put into house arrest, which, as some of you know, is designated residential surveillance. Doesn't mean that he's sitting at home with an ankle bracelet on. It means that he has no privacy, no rights, and he's not allowed to leave whatever area he's in. And it's not even in his own home. According to reports, he was actually close to some coffee shop that was right next to the police station where he's being held. Him and 4 others were arrested and put into this residential surveillance throughout the duration of the games, and we're not quite sure what their charges are at this time. So be praying for those congregants of that church. This is a church that's been very politically active, has a lot of petitioners and political dissidents attending. It's a gospel-fueled church that also fights for the legal rights of Chinese citizens. So our next story is another Chinese citizen who fought for her legal rights, Zhang Zhan. the Christian Chinese citizen journalist who reported on the COVID-19 outbreak in 2019. As some of you know, Zhang Zhan, her life was in the balance late last year in 2021 because she had started a protest with her hunger strike. She didn't eat for most half of the year. For over 6 months, she hadn't eaten anything. She was being force-fed by authorities, which deteriorated her health very quickly. Well, we actually heard recently, though, from Zhang Zhan's mother and her lawyer that she has ended her hunger strike, and she's looking noticeably better. She's smiling, and she's carrying on with conversation. Before, she could hardly stand. She was unrecognizable to some of her relatives, but she's doing much better. So thank you so much for your prayers. Keep the family in your prayers, though. This is not an easy situation. Just because she's healthy, she's still in prison, and her family still faces social ostracization because of this. Our next story comes from a little-known region that we don't talk about very much on our website because there's not a lot of cases that come out of there. A Ningxia house church was raided. Ningxia is a province in China that has the second highest Muslim population in the country. And we haven't heard from it in the last few years, mostly because it's Muslim and we don't have very many Christian sources over there. But recently, Panchi House Church was raided on February 19th. Pastor Gang Zhejun was arrested, and his congregation has been repeatedly harassed since December of 2021, facing 10 to 15 days of administrative detainment for organizing and funding illegal gatherings or just the charge of organizing illegal gatherings. This is notable, of course, because this area is mostly Muslim, and Xinjiang is the number one region in China for the Muslim population, but this is number two, and so we're interested to see more developments from this region as we go forward. So check out ChinaAid.org for more updates. Finally, we have a story from Pastor Pan of the Mayflower Church. Some of you know, Pastor Pan and his 60 congregants have been stranded in South Korea since 2019 as they escaped religious persecution in China. He recently notified ChinaAid about one of his youngest congregants, Eve, who suffered recently from COVID-19. And Pastor Pan has admitted that COVID-19 is somewhat of a concern to the congregation, but not too much. But to this congregant in particular, Eve, she has several pre-existing conditions and other illnesses that gave the church quite a scare when she got COVID-19. 3 years prior, in 2018, she suffered from pneumonia, severe pulmonary effusion, and scarlet fever at just 4 years old. It was a very scary and intense situation. You can read more about it on ChinaAid.org. We have a tab for our campaigns, Pilgrim's Progress. You can find the article there. But she was able to recover at 4 years old, and she got COVID. There was a little bit of a scare, but she's actually recovered fully, we learned today. So at the time of this recording, her and the others who were infected with COVID-19 are doing much better. So please keep the Jeju Church in your prayers, and you can actually reach them at a Gmail to send them encouraging messages and prayers. That Gmail is themayflowerchurch@gmail.com. So please message them. They would love to see your encouraging words. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Bob Fu. Bob?
Well, I want to talk about what's happening in Hong Kong lately. As we all know, after the Hong Kong so-called national security law took effect on July 1st, 2020, the whole basically Hong Kong political, judicial, educational, economic, all the system had been taken over by the Chinese Communist Party. Essentially, the one country, two system had become one country, one system. The communist system. So the one country, two system the Communist Party had promised when Hong Kong was handed over to China from the British control in July 1st, 1997, had been essentially dead. So all the Hong Kong independent pro-democracy legislators, journalists, NGOs, prominent figures had been either imprisoned or exiled or being tried in mainland China, or some chose to escape to Taiwan. Of course, the British government had taken quite a lot of those Hong Kong students. But one of the most prominent figures who is really called the conscience of Hong Kong, a long-time critic of the Communist Party, as Cardinal Zen, Z-E-N. He actually got retired already from the Catholic Church leadership in Hong Kong, had chose to stay in Hong Kong, and he had recently been publicly criticized by a pro-Beijing newspaper called Ta Kung Pao. It's Ta Kung Pao, means a newspaper basically sponsored directly by the Chinese Communist Party. It published an article condemning the 90-year-old Cardinal Joseph Zen. He is the Bishop Emeritus of Hong Kong, has been leading the Hong Kong Catholic Church for many years. So according to this Communist Party's kind of mouthpiece in Hong Kong, Cardinal Kong was condemned with a long history of so-called abusing his clergy status to engage in anti-China activities and stirring up chaos in Hong Kong, end the quote. And he was criticized, of course, for his activism by standing with the students when the students took to the street peacefully protest the Hong Kong proposed national security law. And also initially it was not national security law. It was basically the students were opposing the Chinese Communist Party imposing the Hong Kong high school, I mean from elementary to high school to university students to go a mandatory so-called patriotic education. And that led to the so-called anti-subversion law. The Hong Kong pro-Beijing this legislator and chief executive proposed, of course, under the direction for Beijing Communist Party, for Article 23 of so-called Hong Kong National Security Article in the Hong Kong Basic Law, de facto Hong Kong Constitution. And then eventually the Hong Kong National Security Law was imposed. So the massive protest in 2019, I mean, being watched by the world and showing the brutal Communist Party sent police force, national security force on the Hong Kong street, violently cracking down, and some, hundreds perhaps were even missing to even today, and many were found, dead on the sea, floating. So we even know some names. Mysteriously, some were found jumping out of the high sky, kind of tall buildings in Hong Kong. So it's basically a very suspicious death. The Chinese Communist Party in this mouthpiece article accusing Cardinal Joseph Zen as like instigating the young people and the Catholic believers, the church believers, some prominent one like Jimmy Lai, the billionaire tycoon who is the publisher, the founder of Hong Kong Apple Daily, and Martin Lee, who was credited as the father of modern Hong Kong democracy. He was the founder of Hong Kong Democratic Party, and was one of the most recognized international figures. Who testified before the U.S. Senate Foreign Affairs Committee before he was arrested after he returned, knowing the risk. So, of course, Jimmy Lai is still in jail, and he chose to stay in Hong Kong. He's like a modern-day, kind of Hong Kong version of Ukraine President Zelensky, because both of them, Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee, they can choose to live in London, in Washington, D.C., in Taipei, Australia. Any of these cities, countries, would welcome them to really harbor them and provide refuge for them. But they chose to go back to Hong Kong, basically to fight for freedom, and end up now in prison. So they were, the Communist Party accused Cardinal Joseph Zen somehow as the instigation figure for those like Martin Lee and Jimmy Lai, basically accusing the Catholic Church and Cardinal Zen, Joseph Zen, teaching them somehow in the church for rebellion. It's really just lies after lies. Because Cardinal Zen, before he was appointed as a cardinal, he was served as the bishop of Hong Kong from 2002 to 2009, nearly 10 years. More than 7 years. And then in 2006, the Pope elevated him to the College of Cardinals. Of course, Cardinal Zen at that time already an outspoken critic of Communist parties, the religious freedom crackdown, and arbitrary detention and violation of rule of law. So he's known for his openness and public criticism. And of course, he has not only just sitting in the church criticizing the Communist Party's brutality, he himself walked out. Took participation. Basically. On the street with the workers, with the students, when the peaceful demonstration started. And in fact, when Xi Jinping and his subordinates in Zhejiang province launched that massive forced demolition campaign against the cross in Zhejiang province in 2014 until 2016. Thousands of crosses were forcefully demolished and destroyed. Cardinal Zen actually made statements condemning the Communist Party and its ill-conceived policy, basically launching a war against the cross. And so for that, Cardinal Zen was banned from even entering the mainland China from Hong Kong for already 6 years. Actually, he was also, when the headquarters for the Catholic Church in the Vatican, and the current Pope made a secret deal with the Chinese Communist Party, and Cardinal Zen was so upset, so he traveled to the Vatican and to Rome, waiting for hours under the coldness, try to basically just to get an opportunity to shaking hands with the Pope, so that he can tell the Pope the displeasure and the danger of that kind of secret deal with the Chinese Communist Party. And certainly because of his outspokenness, he was not even consulted before the secret deal was announced, and he was essentially sidelined by the Vatican's pro-Beijing group. So, why this time the Ta Kung Pao's opinion matter, and basically because this Ta Kung Pao represents the Communist Party. That means the Communist Party is ironing the impact, the influence of this 90-year-old cardinal among the Hong Kong citizens, residents over there. And it may signify the Communist Party's next step is to take over the Hong Kong Catholic Church, and it may just forcefully establish Hong Kong three-self patriotic Catholic Church, and establish its own pro-Xi Jinping, pro-Beijing Catholic system. And at the same time, Beijing has been randomly and arbitrarily make the bishop at Catholic Diocese of Xinjiang of Hebei Province missing for over 9 months. So this is Bishop Joseph Zhang Zhan. He is the bishop from Xinjiang in the Henan Province. The 63-year-old bishop was ordained as a bishop in Xinjiang in 1991, and with over 100,000 Catholic believers under his leadership, and who refused to join the government-controlled Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, the Communist Party dictated association. I think for that, the Bishop Zhang was arrested and with totally arbitrary, unlawful detainment for over 9 months. So this is not only in violation of the international law, as written in the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights against the arbitrary detention without due process and fair trial, but really even the Chinese own law is violated. When the bishop, a prominent bishop, Joseph Zhang, was even arbitrarily arrested, and this is certainly qualified as the enforced disappearance. Of course, the Communist Party has never been shy away of punishing those the dissent deemed as non-obedient to his brutal rule. So, Bishop Joseph Zhang was disappeared on May 21st in 2021, and he was seen undergoing cancer surgery, returning to the hospital. Even after that, in the hospital operation, basically the Communist Party specifically launched the targeted campaign against that Catholic diocese, basically not only targeting the church members and bishop, but also targeting the seminaries. There have 100 police officers raided and that the congregation and arrested at least 10 priests and seminarians. So basically these are happening, and we need to pray for this very bold Catholic believers. And there's a piece of good news. 3 for the 5 Christians from Taiyuan Xinjiang Reformed Church was released after all of 5 were arrested for allegedly illegally crossing the national border for attending Christian kind of a revival Bible exposition meeting led by Stephen Tong in Malaysia, capital Kuala Lumpur. And they went out of China with absolutely legal passports and allowed by the border agents and fly to Kuala Lumpur and came back, no problem. And yet the Communist Party arrested all 5, and so 3 of them, praise the Lord, after serving their sentences, being released recently, and 2 leaders are still being held without trial. So continue to pray for Pastor An Yan Kui and Pastor Zhang Chong Hao. They are still under arrest, so for quite a few months without a trial. So pray for them firmly, in that even in their prison, they can continue to witness to those who are persecuted them. And may the Lord continue to bless His church. And thank you so much.